Okay, now let's get started. Awais, I think just as a very initial thing, since a lot of people aren't super connected with space tech, if you could just give a broad idea of what Pixxel does.
Sure, absolutely. Thanks for having me here. So, Pixxel is a space technology company, but more specifically, we are a space data company, which means we deal with data coming in from space. We are building and operating a constellation of satellites that will surround the Earth. These satellites have cameras on them, so they take images of the Earth as they go around it. And we convert the images that are taken into insights. For example, in agriculture, we can identify the crop health status, how healthy the crop is doing, whether it requires some fertilizer, whether it's under irrigated or over irrigated, whether it needs water. Or if you're looking at forestry, we can help identify the forest biodiversity, which species of trees are growing where is deforestation happening, where is it spreading, where are the risks of forest fires coming up. So in domains such as agriculture, oil and gas, energy, mining, environment, climate change, our satellites take these images of the earth, and we it helps us build a health monitor for the planet to see how things are changing from a health perspective for earth. So that's what we do. We build hardware, that is the satellites that will go to space, and we build the software that will enable organizations to take this imagery and then use it for day-to-day insights and actions.
Got it. And so, one thing, I mean, that we were just talking about a little bit earlier in before the session started also is how, we've seen in the past 12 to 18 months sort of a big kind of policy shift that's saying a lot more accommodative policy from the government, right? That is in opening up the space sector as a sector, as an industry for private sector companies, small companies, innovative startups, everybody. Um, in a sense, how has this really translated into the ground reality? In that, are you seeing that, say, government organizations or ISRO, anybody is more open to working with you now? Is that a big help? Or is it mainly in that it just potentially opens up an opportunity where you can continue to work and build out a slightly stronger business than you could have before?
Yeah, the thing is, if you were looking at 2019 or any year before that, so last year is when in the slew of measures to combat the economic slowdown, one of the measures that was announced was the space sector will be opened up to private industry for participation, and ISRO and the Department of Space will help sort of take it off. The thing before that was drastically different in the sense that there were space technology companies trying to do some things, but there was no clarity on how to go about it because this is an industry where some sort of regulation is required. The same technology that can be used for rockets could also be misused for building missiles and things like those. So there needs to be some level of regulation in the industry that we are, but there was no policy in place. Like we could build a satellite here in India, but to launch this satellite, you require some permissions from a telecommunication perspective, from an imaging perspective. There was no one knew who was to give this permission. The assumption was that only Israel will continue to do this. And that applied for communication satellites, imaging satellites, rockets, and whatnot. What changed last year is that gave impetus to ISRO, the Department of Space, to say that we have done so much as a government owned entity for the past 4 or 5 decades. Now it's time to take that and build on top of that for private industry to do this as well. So the clarity that came after that was one, no one had a doubt that if you build a satellite, it would go up to space or not. No one had a doubt that if you go ahead and build a rocket, whether we can launch it or not. Now there was a clear indication that if we go ahead and build this technology, that we will be able to use it. And a slew of different policy drafts also came out. A telecommunication policy draft came out, which stated that if you are a company that is trying to operate satellites, these are the permissions you need to get, and you just need to apply to one entity, which is called InSpace. Here is the form for you. So that made it very clear and straightforward for anyone to say, this is what we need to fill, this is who we need to send it to, and then this part of the licensing will be done. Same for someone trying to build ground stations to communicate with satellites, for someone trying to build rockets. So communications draft came out, the remote sensing draft came out recently, the space transportation draft came out, human transport draft came out. So a whole bunch of things opened up, which means that one of the risks that was there when investors saw investing in space companies was will there be a regime that would support it in a regulatory manner? And that went out of the way, which meant that investors were now more comfortable in putting in money because one risk was completely out of the way. And the difference we also saw was ISRO and the Department of Space were more willing to engage to help. 2 years ago, we tried, booking a launch in India for our satellite. At that point in time, there was no mechanism to do it, which is why we said we will launch through a Russian rocket. What happened after the announcement last year was Department of Space themselves reached out saying that we are opening this sector now as an Indian built satellite. We'd like for your satellite to fly on an Indian built rocket, and that made sense for us as well. Why would we take our satellite all the way to Russia to launch it when we can do it directly from here? We became the first company ever to which ISRO opened its door for the testing of our satellite as well. So our first satellite, which will be launching later this year, was tested at the satellite center here in Bangalore. And that's a drastic change, right? Where they proactively reached out to us. They want to see private companies succeed. Versus 2 years ago, when the assumption was that the only entity that will go and do something was ISRO. So definitely, there's been a monumental change in how things are being looked at, and it's now I would say a priority for the Department of Space to make sure that there are some success stories that come out of India from a space tech perspective.
And in this entire thing, you're talking about basically all the permissions that you need. Once entity will have solved all these problems, right? So that's a good move. And I also wanted to ask, how different is the Indian space tech setup from, say, the US or Europe or even Russia? How different is it, especially in the private space? And is that changing right now with more companies coming in? Is that changing? ISRO was a big sort of an entity. So is that changing with more this thing coming up, with more private entities coming up? And is there a specific focus area for Indian space startups as such that we are looking at, and not, say, putting somebody on the moon or something? Or is there a specific area, say software, say launch machines? Is that something we are looking at right now in the Indian startup space?
So let me take the names of the countries you took, right? So starting with Russia, Russia is a different beast. There are some startups that are coming up, but it's not, again, it's been a country where it's only been the Russian space agency that's concentrated on putting missions up there. They commercially operate it. So I think globally, there have been only two agencies that have had the mandate for generating revenue and operating commercially, the Russian Space Agency and ISRO. Russia is continuing to go down on the same path, but ISRO recently has sort of changed, right? Earlier, there used to be some targets that we have the PSL we built. We need to launch foreign satellites and generate sort of this much revenue. Whereas no other space agency, if you look at European Space Agency, if you look at NASA, if you look at JAXA, they don't have a mandate that they need to be able to go out and generate revenue, which is very different. So space agencies are supposed to focus on research and advancing technology, putting in resources where private companies can't put in. Once that technology is established, it has been given over to the commercial sector to be able to take it. If I take the example of the US, it started in around 1990s, where a remote sensing draft came out then. And NASA said, we have seen, we have built this technology, we have proven it. Now it doesn't make sense for us to go ahead and commercialize it. Why would we need to sell data? Let the commercial industry come up. It'll get us jobs. It'll mean more companies coming up, more types of data. So that's when it sort of started. In the past 2 decades, we have seen how the rocket companies in the US have also come up. SpaceX single-handedly launches more satellites combined than every other country in the world. And that's only happened because the space agency said our focus is research, and private industry will take up all the commercial activities. A similar thing in a slower manner has happened in Europe, where the European Space Agency gives out grants, and there are multiple different startups coming up in different countries like France, Germany, and so on and so forth. And that's where we are in India. We are at a precipice where right now it is moving from just a space agency trying to do all the things commercially to private companies coming and saying, now we will take up the commercial part of it. That is no focus on sending people to space, building space stations, getting research and information that comes out of that. And if any space power that needs to look at it seriously, need to have both of these in balance. There needs to be money, resources put in on pure research and advanced tech, where no one else will put in money, as well as the commercial side of things, where the tech that's already been proven is brought into the commercial domain. That's the difference I would see. Like where we are right now as a country, I would say we are 5 to 10 years away from where the US was in terms of the companies coming up. But we're also moving much faster. We have seen success stories that have come out of startups in the US. We have seen success stories that have come out of Europe. And we do have the infrastructure, the expertise, the experience in our country to make that happen as well. So now is the right time for any space startup to come in and say, because it's a blank canvas we're looking at. And investors globally are also very interested in this. So that's what I would say. Like, we are very similar, but we're also a little late, but we're moving faster than others.
Right. And to get a little more into the details, so this idea that you have the R&D, not R&D actually so much as just pure research kind of being done by a government funded entity, and you have that is used as kind of a foundation for private players to actually set up a kind of thriving industry. Um, what kind of technology are you using at Pixxel, right? What kind of satellites, if we're going to get a little more into the details, like how, in terms of the development for work that you've done for these satellites, what have you built on? Why did you pick that? What did you made you see the kind of potential in that? Because I mean, you're mostly in working in imaging and remote sensing, right? So what kind of granular decisions did you take when you're starting the company that, this is how we're going to do it, this is what technology we're going to use? Why did you pick that? Why do you think that works for an Indian perspective, or an Indian business, or even you might have global customers, but that,
Yes.
choice there?
Sure. I think it started with when I started looking at existing sources of satellite data that were available today. Like what is the data that US owned satellites, European owned satellites, open source data? What are the applications we can do with this? Because some problems, the scale at which they are, the only data set that can help you solve it is satellite. When you're trying to establish what crop is grown in an entire district, entire state, entire country, and even the globe, you can't fly drones or you can't fly airplanes, because after a point it becomes exorbitantly expensive. The only data set you require is satellite imagery. So I started looking at some problems that you could solve with satellite imagery. Specifically, I was studying in Rajasthan, and illegal mining was rampant in the state. How do we see who's illegally mining something? Can we see which mineral or material they are mining? Whether it's normal stone, whether it's calcium, whether it's something else that's more valuable. Delhi and Gurgaon are a few hours away from campus. Every year we read the news that they become the most polluted cities in the world. Where is this emission coming from? Are people actually adhering to the regulations that are there? Can satellite imagery help us tackle that? Or if you're looking at agriculture, every year we read so much percentage of the crop has been lost due to some pest infestation or crop disease or lack of fertilizers. Why can't we solve that at scale? Then we have satellite imagery. So when I was looking at that, that's when I realized that existing satellite data was useful for a lot of use cases, but there were still gaps. There were invisible spots for existing satellites where they are blind to these problems. Even today, if you go out and try to search for data, that will tell you which crop species you're looking at. If you want to identify the exact kind of mineral or stone that's being mined, or where the emissions are coming from, what poisonous gases are those emissions consisting of, you can't do that. And that's where we saw the gap specifically. We said that there's possibility globally for a much better type of imaging to come in from space. And that imaging technology which would enable us to do that was called hyperspectral imaging. So Pixxel specifically is building hyperspectral satellites that beam down 50 times more information than any of the existing satellites. And these invisible problems that I talked about, hyperspectral is something that's able to see those problems. So we saw a gap and opportunity not only in India, but globally, because even today you can't go out and find this data anywhere. It's only been proven as a concept by NASA, by ESA, and even by ISRO. But doing it on a commercial perspective where you can use it on a daily basis or a weekly basis, that was something that has not been possible. So we said, globally there's a gap for this data, there's an opportunity. We will build and deploy a constellation of hyperspectral satellites, something that no one else has done before, and use this data to better what existing global satellite imagery providers are doing. There's no competition. There was no competition in India when we started out. We were one of the first ones trying to do this. Our competition naturally became what the global satellite players were doing. And that's something that's unique to space. You can't constrain yourself to a boundary and say, I'll build something that's only good for India, because once you put a satellite up there, it's going to rotate the entire globe. When you build rockets, people are not going to come here or there. They just go to wherever it's cheapest. So you are like in a global game by nature if you're in space technology, except in a few use cases, right? So we had to build something that was globally unique, and that's why we're in this space. The use cases and the applications of Earth observation data, they are nowhere close to the potential they can be. Like to be able to get to each and every farmer advisory on what type of crop you should grow, what type of fertilizer you should use through government as an intermediary in between. We haven't tapped the potential of that. banks and insurances can do a whole lot of more accurate type of analysis if they have satellite imagery. Governments, state governments, national government has not really used it for monitoring sustainable development goals, the emissions and things like those. So the reason why we specifically went after Earth observation is one, the potential is nowhere close to where it should be. And secondly, we found an opportunity in the gap doing something 50 times better, which would give us an advantage not only in India but globally. So that's specifically about this.
I also wanted to understand more about the customer base. What sort of, how do you, who are your main customers? Who are you looking at as the main customer? This thing, and how do you get this idea to them? Especially because it's a new sort of a technology. So to get the customers going and getting, who are these customers going to be? Is it going to be the large farmers looking at big farmlands? Is it going to be state and central governments? And also with regard to the state and central government, from what I understand, there are laws regarding, especially your entire geographic marking and all that. There are laws regarding that. So how do you balance both of them together, getting sort of those permissions and all that? Because if you get into an area where which it's not supposed to be covered, and that gets into a sort of a muddle. So can you just elaborate a little bit more on that?
Sure. So on the customer side of things, it's sort of drawn midway between government customers and private customers. India is a nascent market in the Earth observation analytics space. There are not a lot of companies or organizations that have used this. So it's a blank canvas for us. We need to set up that ecosystem, which is something that we're trying to do, right? But if you're looking at customers, it would be on an agricultural side, it would be large fertilizer companies. Why would a fertilizer company want to use satellite imagery? They want to know in which part of the country what nutrient is lacking from the soil. So if you look at soil in a particular region and we say nitrogen is missing from the soil here, they know where to focus their logistics to get nitrogen fertilizers there and sell to the farmers, or phosphorus in some other area. There would be large owners of farmland. There are not a lot. India is a smallholder farmer community, but if you're looking at it globally, there are entities and organizations that have millions of square acres of land that they need to be able to cover. And the only imagery you can do it with is satellite imagery. So they would need this data to identify problem areas and then go there and solve those issues. Energy companies or oil and gas companies would be another. Governments usually put certain restrictions on them that if your pipeline leaks above this volume or there's a leakage of oil or gas, then we're going to fine you this much. And it's obviously financial loss to them. What we can do with satellites is say that there's a leak here underground as well as above ground, which helps them save money as well as help save the environment from a regulatory compliance perspective. And then there are governments, of course. Every government needs to know what is the particular type of crop that's growing in the country. Like whether you want to import some crop at the end of it, or you want to export and there's going to be a surplus. When you're looking at insurance for the entire country, for example, the Prime Minister's Fasal Bima Yojana, how exactly do you verify whether a farmer is telling you the truth, whether they'd actually grown this crop here or not, and whether the damage is actually this much? The only imagery you need is this. So agriculture, oil and gas companies, governments, both state and national, these would be some customers that do come to us. But in India specifically, yes, it's an up and coming market. We need to do a little bit of education before it's as widespread as in other countries, but that's an opportunity in itself. And from a permission standpoint, how it sort of works is it's once you put a satellite in space, it's like international waters. You can take images of anywhere. The only restriction that you have from a law perspective is that the United Nations Outer Space Treaty states that if you take an image of a particular country and that country asks for those images, you have to sell those images at a reasonable rate. You can't demand exorbitant rates for the images you've taken of that country. But once your satellites are up there, it's like international waters. You can take images anywhere. And our satellites specifically are not so minute that it will invade privacy. We can't identify individual cars or nameplates or things like that. What we can do is sort of on a large scale basis. Yeah, that's sort of how it's been. Like if not us, then there'll be some other satellite imagery from which you can get it. That's what I would say on the permissions bit. But each country puts some restrictions on the kind of imagery you can do, where you can sell to, what kinds of entities you can sell to. So there's definitely checks in place.
Got it. Got it. I think so. There's a question, kind of a small question, which is from Akbar, which is, are Pixxel satellites going to be in geosynchronous orbit? And if not, which regions would you focus on first?
Yeah, these are not in geosynchronous orbit. So geosynchronous orbit is usually 24,000 kilometers from the surface, which is too far to take images of good enough quality. So we keep it in the low Earth orbit. It ranges between 400 to 800 kilometers usually. Our satellite specifically will be about 600 kilometers from the surface of the Earth. And they rotate, they revolve around the Earth 16 times a day. So that way, our coverage from the satellites is global. We don't focus on any one particular country. Once we put the satellites up there, we can take images of anywhere. The reason why you want to do a constellation of 36 satellites is because with 36, we can do it on a daily frequency. So an increase in number of satellites means increase in how frequently we can get an image of a place. But coverage itself, we will have global coverage from day one, almost global coverage.
And a little more on, basically your core kind of value proposition is that you're using hyperspectral imaging, right? Which gives you, in a way, much more detailed imaging because it's covering a much larger spectrum of radiation that you're picking up, basically light, you could say, to simplify it, that you're picking up. So, how wide is that band and what additional data do you really get from that? When you're talking about things like looking at soil quality, and you're basically using these fairly small cube satellites, right? These kind of micro satellites, which I think, have you launched anything that you mentioned in the Russia launch?
Nothing in a
You'll be launching the Anand project.
We will not launch that one in April. The first satellite going up in April.
Yeah. So what additional kind of imaging do you get with this kind of? What range do you have, and what additional imaging are you getting? How does that really help you tell things like soil quality, as opposed to say a gas leak, which might be a little more obvious to somebody?
Yeah. So here's how I'll break it down. There are three types of imagery you can say you can get down from space. There is RGB imagery, there is multispectral, and there's hyperspectral. When you say RGB imagery, it's an image that you take from your phone. So anything that you take from your phone camera, that's an RGB image. You're seeing information in red, green, and blue wavelengths. So that's just three wavelengths. Then you go to multispectral. An example here would be the night vision goggles that we have seen, right? In the day, you're able to see normally, but in the night, you're also able to see the heat signatures of the people if it's dark. And that means it's going into the infrared range. The amount of information you're getting usually is in about 10 channels. So we have RG and D plus a few in the infrared range. So we're going from information in RGB, which is 3 channels, to maybe 10 channels in RGB and infrared. Where hyperspectral shines is the amount of information you're getting is in hundreds of channels across the entire visible near infrared and short wave infrared range. So the eyes that we see usually is restricted from between 400 to 600, 700 nanometers. But with our satellites, we'll be able to go up to 2,500 nanometers. Now, what does that mean in real life? Let me take a farm, for example, and you've taken 3 images of that farm, RGB, multispectral, hyperspectral. With an RGB image, what I can say with that image, looking at that image, is something that I can do with my normal eyes. I can tell you what part of the image is cropland, what part of the area is road or buildings and something like that, nothing beyond that. Multispectral takes me one step ahead. If I look at a multispectral image of that farm, I can tell you what the health status of the crop is, whether it's green, whether it's red, whether it's yellow, whether it's good, bad, somewhere in between. What hyperspectral imagery will tell you if you're looking at that and analyzing it is it will tell you firstly what are the nutrient contents in the soil, whether it's lacking a particular type of thing there, what fertilizer I need to use. It will tell me what specific crop of what specific species of crop I'm looking at. It will tell me whether this part of the crop has been irrigated, this part of the land has not been irrigated. It will tell me what the humidity content in the area is. It will tell me what the chlorophyll content in the leaves is. So that granularity is something that you get in hundreds of times through our hyperspectral that you can't with multispectral and RGB. So the images that you are able to get today are either RGB or multispectral. When we send across hyperspectral, it will just take the analysis level one notch higher. So that's what I say when I say 50 times more data. You're going literally from 3 bands to 10 bands that are available today to more than 400 bands that we will provide this.
And so just a few questions coming up. I'm just going to kind of bunch them up and take the main kind of points, which is one is I think a couple of people are asking in terms of competition and also in terms of what ISRO already offers in imaging. I think ISRO has also done a little bit in hyperspectral imaging. They had one launch either planned or something, I can't remember exactly. But most imaging, I think, is not hyperspectral, and I don't think there's any commercial operator in the world yet, is there?
So yeah, so the only entity in India today that has Earth observation data is ISRO.
Mhm.
But the difference is that the satellites that are launched focus only on the Indian segment, and the frequency with which you get these images is also every 14 days or every 28 days, which is nowhere good enough for you to meet. Like we will provide global revisit, whereas the satellites that are there will provide either every 14 days or 28 days. So that's the difference. The priorities or the end goals of what ISRO is trying to do are vastly different from what private industries would want to do. So even though ISRO does have imaging satellites, that's not really a competition. They launched a hyperspectral satellite a couple of years ago, but the data from that is not openly available. That's something that's only for internal consumption. So what does a analytics company or company like ourselves that want to analyze this data do? You can't really get that information, which is where, like in general, everywhere across the world, private companies are needed to sort of bring the cost of the data down as well, so that more and more people are able to do that. So, like that's the exact problem. The only entity in India today that has these images is ISRO, and their main focus is not commercializing it. It's not going out to as many areas and industries as possible. Which is why private companies needed to come and say, we're going to bring this cost down, we're going to bring these use cases, we're going to go to this industry, this industry. And it's a like by building on top of that experience, what is was already there is what will enable us to get to the next level. So that's what I would say on that. From a competition perspective, there have been a couple of Earth observation startups that have recently come up, but they're just starting out in the ideation stage. There are a couple of rocket companies who are getting very close to launch, maybe next late this year or early next year. We have companies that are trying to manufacture satellites for other companies. So in the last 2-3 years, we've seen a lot of companies come up. But as of now, in terms of launching an Earth observation satellite, I think we're the only ones that have built a satellite out. But thankfully, policy is opening up. More and more companies are coming up that want to do the same thing, which is in general good for the industry.
Right, I think that brings us to another point. A couple of questions that are there is one is Akbar, I think, is asking what is the expected, let's say, ballpark pricing that you would look at now that you're talking about lowering the cost of imaging, right, for industries across the board. What kind of rough price segments would you look at in terms of for your hyperspectral imaging data? And also that is in terms of, we talked about the kind of customers you're targeting. Are you in conversations with any customers right now? Is there anyone where you're going to kind of launch with once you have your launch up and ready in October?
Sure. So I think on the price side of things, existing satellite data in the market today on the lower side is around $2 per square kilometers. On the higher side, it is about $60 per square kilometer. So when you're looking at larger areas, it quickly adds up. So it ranges between $2 on the lower side to $60 on the higher side. We would be on the lower side, or in fact, even lower than that. The virtue of the fact that we're manufacturing in India, we're keeping it low cost, we're doing small satellites. Broadly, without giving exact numbers, I would say we would be on the lower side of that number, very close to the absolute lowest between 2 and 60. Apart from that, on the customer perspective, we are already working with a few customers on pilots. We have a smaller camera, the same camera that we go on our satellite, that we put on drones, and we show a use case to a client. We show that this is what you can do with hyperspectral that you couldn't do otherwise. And then the next step to that is replacing with satellite imaging. So we have already run a couple of pilots already. There are a few more that are coming up. And there are a lot of clients that are spread across the world that are waiting for our imagery to come down. So agreements in place, MOUs in place, LOIs in place that say that this is a data set that they've been waiting for years. And when we do bring it down, once our satellites have gone up, we have clients lined up to buy it. So yes, we've been closely working with customers and clients already with a few, and then plan to work with the rest once the imagery comes down.
And there's another question about what would you see as a competency for an opportunity for imaging analysis? What would be the main competency? Will it be, is it widely available? Are there specialized courses for this sort of a thing? And is there an opportunity in identifying ocean changes in the oceans and all that sort of thing, like climate change and all that? Is there an opportunity there as well in identifying sort of changes in the patterns and weather patterns and all that with hyperspectral imaging? Is that also in the pipeline?
Yeah, as I mentioned, we're building a health monitor for the planet, and that's something Pixxel is uniquely positioned to do. We can tell which poisonous gases are coming in from where it needs to be curbed down. We can tell which poisonous chemicals have been ingested into water bodies, whether it's oceans or somewhere else. We can identify plankton health in parts of the ocean, marine life, biodiversity, and things like those. So climate change is a big use case. I mentioned environment, forestry, climate change, all that clubbed into one thing where we can help identify how the markers for the health of our planet are changing. And from a use case perspective, one of the things you have seen is that a lot of companies or organizations or industries where there is a need for using satellite imagery in general have not gone down that path. And the reason is because working with satellite imagery is not considered easy. You need some sort of a degree, you need some sort of an experience. The one other thing that we are doing as well to ease this at Pixxel is we're building up this platform wherein anyone with a basic knowledge of computers and browsers should be able to drag and drop things to build out a workflow for them to be able to get to an insight. It would be as simple as saying that I will drag and drop this area. I want analysis for the state of Karnataka. And I want to clean up the imagery that I have gotten over that area with a cloud removal thing. So you can just drag and drop a tool we have provided for cloud removal. And say they want to identify the percentage composition of maize grown in Karnataka. They can just drag and drop that algorithm that we have ourselves built in the backend. And they want to generate it as an Excel sheet or a map or something else. They just have to bring that together, connect it as a workflow, and then they get the output that they want. And that is very important if this is, as an industry, is supposed to do. We should remove the friction, the blocks that are there for anyone to come in and use this data. Even though imagery itself is valuable, it's not valuable if no one can extract usefulness out of it. So that's what I would say. More and more companies like SatSure, Tropin in India, have been focusing on agriculture, for example, or insurance or disasters. There are other companies that are coming up as well. So the more data we can get into the hands of these people, and the more easy we can make the analysis to platforms like ourselves, then the usefulness of it will just keep on increasing.
So yeah, there's another good point. Another thing who hasn't given a name has mentioned, and that kind of ties into this, which is since you're offering, you're offering imaging, you're also offering analytics and kind of software platform in a sense. Would you be monetizing like a SaaS kind of company in where you have sort of recurring revenue coming in with your clients, long-term contracts, maybe where you're looking at it from that kind of perspective?
That's correct. Yeah, it'll be a subscription-based model, except in a few cases where it will be project-based. For example, country government might come and say that we want to identify how much percentage of our country land is forests. That might be a one-time project that is done once or twice a year. But in most cases, it will be recurring revenue and on a weekly, monthly basis. I'll take an example of an agri company again. Say they have a large swath of land that they want monitored. The contracts in the region usually are either 3 years or 5 years or 7 years from when they sign it. So there's going to be recurring revenue for those many years. And on the weekly usage, if they buy this much imagery this week, this week, they pay us on a monthly basis. So it's definitely like an MRR and an ARR thing. We sign contracts for the long run. The customers also want something for the long run because they want uniformity of data. They can't keep changing data sets. So that is where we're going towards. The platform also becomes important because it gives a business like ourselves, um, what do you call it, revenue which you can project, which you can predict.
Right. And what kind of timelines are you really looking at, or rather in terms of say the next 2 or 3 years, how do you plan to build it up? Right, you've got your launch planned, which has been pushed to from April to October, which is fairly usual for satellite launches and rocket launches. It's a hard and fast thing. Is obviously a very long-term business. It's a little bit like semiconductors in that you've got a lot of research and R&D that costs and go and a lot of capital that's needed upfront. And then it's a very capex heavy business, conventional business job. So how do you see building it out over the next 2 or 3 years now that there seems to be investor interest at least to back it up?
Yeah, so you have to go about it phase wise. We have raised enough to launch these 2 satellites I'm talking about this year, right? Once we have those up, we have essentially proven that we as a company can get down data from space that customers can use. And after that point, it's just replicating that. And we do not need all 36 up there at the get-go for us to start generating revenue. As soon as we have some minimum number of satellites, we can start selling that data, which will give us revenue. But even though it's capex heavy, once you have spent on the infrastructure, it pays back for itself, right? So the lifetime of these satellites ranges between 7 to 10 years. So once you put them up there, you recover the cost you've spent on all that in about a year or so, which means that for the next 7 to 10 years in which they're operating, we're generating above and top of what you spend, minus the operational costs that are there. So yes, it's sort of like the semiconductor industry where you have to put in money to set up that foundry to be able to put up that infrastructure. But once that's there, the demand for satellite imagery sort of pays for itself. On an operating basis, the margins are very high, and you also recover the infrastructure you spend, the cost on the infrastructure you spend fairly soon in just a few months if you're able to execute it properly and the data is something that the customers want. So our sales, for example, 2 satellites this year, which are demo satellites. Once we have proven that this imagery can be used for a lot of use cases, we have customers lined up to start paying for our data. And then from next year, 2022, we will plan to launch about 10 more of these satellites, which will get us to another level of generating recurring revenue. And then in 2023, 26 more to complete a 36 satellite constellation. Once we are there, you don't need to launch anymore, and it'll just be recovering what you have spent within a few months and then just operating on it.
Do you have any kind of plan to eventually expand beyond that 36 satellite constellation, or do you think that's good enough for everything, and then you'll work on, the analytics side of it, the analytics and the software side of it, especially since even if you're building a sort of drag and drop platform, you'd actually then, in a way, it's complex for you to build because you need to then build out for a lot of use cases, very specific tools that just everybody can use, right? Unlike giving raw data, which someone has to analyze, if you're giving a way for them to filter it, then you need to have very specific filters and options to play with the data for, say, agriculture, for defense, for it is very needs very specific. The way you analyze data will be very different from industry to industry that way.
Yeah, so we see hyperspectral as sort of a superset of other imagery sets. Like you can do what you can do with multispectral and RGB with hyperspectral. It's like a superset of other types of imagery that you can do. But we do have plans of expanding to other kinds of imagery as well, maybe thermal satellite data later on, other kinds of data sets. So the expansion that we have planned after the basic 36 satellite has gone up is two ways. One is on the platform itself. The more and more backend infrastructure and tools we can add, the more and more customers will come and the more easier it will get for them. And on the other side, we will see, depending on the demand from the customers, whether we need to add more different kinds of satellites and what kinds we need to do. So that will purely be on a demand perspective. But for now, our plan is in the next 2.5 years, put these satellites that we're planning up, build a sustainable business foundation from that. From there, expanding will become easier depending on what the demand is, what the market is asking.
I had two questions. One was on the entire investor part of the equation. How much, because these are investments that will require huge ticket size, right? You can't do with smaller. This thing won't make sense. It needed. So, is there any effort by you guys to approach the government agency, somebody from the government? Are you looking at some sort of a sovereign fund investing in sort of the space in a startup like yours to begin with?
A sovereign fund would be helpful.
Yeah. So that is there. And I also wanted to understand, I had a question about, do you see Indian space startups providing plug and play platform services to other multinational players in the long run and in the medium run as well?
Yeah, on the first question, a sovereign fund would definitely be helpful, right? We have seen examples in Finland where the Finnish government sovereign fund invested in ISI, their biggest satellite imaging company doing radar imaging. We have seen investments come out of the Japanese sovereign fund where money has gone in. The US has a large seed funding program through which they provide at least $2 to $5 million to well-performing startups to be able to build something up, which means that the amount of risk they need to take before raising venture capital money drastically reduces. We are young in terms of the industry that we're doing, but setting up some sort of at least a seed fund or a grant fund for the initial stages of the company where they're most susceptible to die, that would be helpful because investors need to see some sort of traction, some sort of technical validation before they want to put in money. So having grant money where the government gives that money for people to be able to show an MVP or a prototype before going to raise would definitely increase the number of people that are not dying and then coming out building space startups. But in the later stages, yes, a sovereign fund would be more willing to put in money in technologies where it will help the country in general. But that doesn't stop anyone, right? If you're able to show that tech works, if you're able to show that the business works, there's enough money globally coming in into space technology startups. Seeing the success stories in other countries, if you're able to do, if you're able to better that in India as well, I think the money will come. But obviously, having some sort of a government backing helps. As of now, nothing like that has been set up, but we hope it will be in the years to come. In terms of plug and play services in the coming years, why not? I mean, as a country, we have the infrastructure, the expertise, experience, as I mentioned before, to be able to build space hardware. Companies like Dhruva Space are already trying to do this. They're building small platforms so people can come in and say, we need a satellite like this. They'll build that and they'll do that. Companies like Beletics are trying to provide last mile delivery for different kinds of things. So we have all the things, all the right ingredients for us to be able to do that. Apart from Dhruva Space, I don't see any company that's doing it today, but there might be in the coming years. And that will be an area of growth.
Okay, great. I think we have reached the end of our time slot. So we'll just wrap up. If anyone has any other questions or would like to raise their hand, you can type it in. There's one kind of pending question, which is from Akbar to Awais, which is how does he get in touch with you?
Yeah, so you can either reach out to a form on our website, or you can write an email to contact@pixxel.space, and someone from the team relevant to your query will definitely reach out.
Okay. One kind of final call for any more questions, if anybody has it. We give it, say, 10 seconds so someone has time to type. It doesn't seem like anyone has anything. So that's good. Okay, great. This was a great discussion, guys. Thanks so much, Awais, for being here and explaining everything.
Thank
It
you.
was really fun.
Thank you. It was fun for me as well. Thank you for having me.
Okay, thanks everyone who came in. Hope it was a good session and we got some interesting new information out. All right.
Have a good day.
Bye.